therefore right stop, collaborate and listen. Brexit is back with the brand new edition. No deal is the latest sensation. Because I make a mess of these negotiations. Should we be worried? I don't know, but I'm stockpiling food like there is no tomorrow. The DUP control a new world order. Why can't the EU? There won't be a hard border. Deadly at the negotiating table. Most definitely not. Weak and unstable. The checkers plan was my last resort. But take reassurance from the blue and gold passport. People should listen to the message that I send them. No deal is better than a second referendum. Single market access. We can't solve it. Immigration, though, we can finally control it. No deal. Brexit.
Judgment in the matter of the UK withdrawal from the European Union legal continuity Scotland Bill.
In March of this year, the Scottish Parliament passed the UK withdrawal from the European Union, open brackets, legal continuity, close brackets, open brackets, Scotland, close brackets, bill. This provides for the continued validity in Scots law of retained European Union law. It did so before the UK Parliament had passed its own European Union, open brackets, withdrawal, close brackets, Act. Under Section 33 of the Scotland Act 1998, the law officers can refer to this court a bill passed by the Scottish Parliament before it receives royal assent, so that this court can rule on whether it would be within the legislative powers granted to the Scottish Parliament by the Scotland Act. In April of this year, the Attorney General and the Advocate General for Scotland referred to us a number of questions about the Scottish Bill. Before the hearing of that reference in this court, the UK Parliament passed the European Union Withdrawal Act, which came into force in June. This makes similar provision to the Scottish Bill, but on a UK-wide basis. So, in addition to the questions originally referred, we have to decide what difference, if any, that makes. The judgment which is handed down today is the judgment of all 7 of the justices who have taken part in this case. We wish to make it clear that it is no part of our function to determine or to influence the political questions which underlie this dispute. Our role is a purely legal one. Would the bill be within the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament if it were to receive royal assent and become an act? This depends upon a close and detailed examination of the Scotland Act, the Scottish Bill, and the UK Act. Section 29 of the Scotland Act limits the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. 3 of those limitations are relevant to this case. First, a provision of an Act of the Scottish Parliament is outside its legislative powers if it relates to one or more of the reserved matters set out in Schedule 5 to the Scotland Act. Those reserved matters include international relations and the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Secondly, a provision of an Act of the Scottish Parliament is outside its legislative powers if it modifies certain legal provisions which are listed in Schedule 4 to the Scotland Act. These include certain provisions of the European Communities Act 1972 and many of the provisions of the Scotland Act itself. The UK Parliament's European Union Withdrawal Act added itself to the list of those enactments which could not be modified. Section 126, subsection 1 of the Scotland Act provides that the term modify includes amend or repeal. This court concludes that a protected law will be modified by a later provision, not only if it's expressly amended or repealed, but also if it is in substance amended, superseded, disapplied, or repealed by a later one. However, a provision does not modify a protected law simply because it makes additional provision in the same field of law. Thirdly, a provision of an Act of the Scottish Parliament is outside its legislative powers if it is incompatible with European Union law. Incidentally, the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament concluded that the bill would be outside its legislative powers for this reason. The Lord Advocate, advising the Scottish Government, disagreed. The first question the court has to answer is whether the bill as a whole would be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament because it relates to reserved matters. The court's answer is that it would not. In particular, although international relations are a reserved matter, the bill is not concerned with international relations, including relations with the European Union. It is concerned with purely domestic rules of law designed to regulate the legal consequences in Scotland of the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. The court does not accept the other arguments which the UK law officers advance in relation to this question. The bill is not contrary to the constitutional framework underpinning the devolution settlement, if it is not contrary to the Scotland Act, which provides that framework in relation to Scotland. Neither is the bill contrary to the rule of law, as there is nothing contrary to the rule of law in having legislation governing the domestic legal consequences of withdrawal from the European Union at both the United Kingdom and the Scottish levels, provided that they do not conflict in a manner which is not permitted by the Scotland Act. The second question the court has to answer is whether Section 17 of the bill is outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. Section 17 provides that regulations and other subordinate legislation made by United Kingdom ministers under powers conferred by acts of the United Kingdom Parliament, to the extent that they relate to devolved matters, shall have no legal effect unless the consent of the Scottish ministers has first been obtained. The UK law officers make two arguments. First, they argue that Section 17 modifies Section 28, subsection 7 of the Scotland Act, which provides that the power of the Scottish Parliament to make laws, quote, does not affect the power of the Parliament of the United Kingdom to make laws for Scotland, end quote. Section 28, subsection 7 is one of the provisions protected against modification by Schedule 4. The court accepts this argument and holds that Section 17 would modify Section 28, subsection 7 of the Scotland Act, since it would render the effect of laws made by the United Kingdom Parliament, conferring powers on United Kingdom ministers in relation to Scotland, conditional on the consent of the Scottish ministers. Secondly, the law officers argue that Section 17 relates to the reserved matter of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, but the court rejects that argument. The third question is whether Section 33 and Schedule 1 of the bill, which repeal references to European Union law in Sections 29 and 57 of the Scotland Act, governing the powers of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government respectively, would be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. The UK law officers make two arguments. First, they argue that the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate so as to determine its own competence. Secondly, they argue that the Scottish Parliament cannot rely on the power given to it by the Scotland Act to repeal spent provisions in that Act, because the provisions referring to EU law will not be spent until the European Communities Act 1972 has been repealed, something which has not yet happened. The court does not accept either of those arguments. First, the Scottish Parliament is not determining its own competence if it exercises a power given to it by the Scotland Act to repeal spent provisions. Secondly, the provisions would be spent when Section 33 comes into force, since the bill provides that the Scottish ministers can make regulations to bring Section 33 into force only after the United Kingdom has withdrawn from the European Union. The fourth question is whether the various provisions of the bill would be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament because they would be incompatible with European Union law, or because they would modify Section 2, subsection 1 of the European Communities Act 1972, a protected enactment, or would be contrary to the rule of law. The court does not accept the arguments of the UK law officers on these matters. essentially because Section 1, subsection 2 of the bill would postpone the coming into effect of any provision in the bill which would be incompatible with EU law until the relevant EU provision had ceased to have effect in Scotland as a consequence of United Kingdom withdrawal. It follows that of the various challenges to the bill, in the initial reference, only the challenge to Section 17 succeeds. However, the European Union Withdrawal Act changes the legal landscape. The bill has to be judged not as at the date when it was passed, but as at the date when it would receive royal assent. The UK Act is protected against modification, which prevents the Scottish Bill from amending, superseding, disapplying or repealing provisions of that Act. At the Court's invitation, Council prepared a schedule in which they set out their respective contentions on which provisions of the Scotland Bill would modify provisions of the UK Act. That resulted in a measure of agreement, although there remained matters in dispute. For the detailed reasons set out in the judgment, which I do not propose to summarise in this presentation, the following provisions of the bill would, at least in part, be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. These are Sections 2, subsection 2, 5, 7, subsection 2b and subsection 3, Section 8, subsection 2, Section 9a, Section 9b, subsections 2, 3a and 4a of Section 10, Sections 11, 13b, 14, 14a, 15, 16, 19, subsection 1, 22, 26a, subsection 6, and 33, and Schedule 1, paragraphs 11a and 16. Therefore, apart from those provisions and Section 17, this Court holds that the Scottish Bill is within the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. The Court will now adjourn.
Pass the words in my mouth, the silence sings a sweeter song than anything we've heard before. A symphony of stars and of sunsets, desperate cries of a lonesome man. So let the music wrap you up in its arms. Let it hold you close and never let you go. The mystery of love sings its strength over you. Can you hear the silent song of hope? is gonna last a lifetime. So may I have this dance. Every separation is a promise to return. There's beauty in the emptiness where the fires of love can burn. Every bit of letting go is a holding on to hope. I gotta know we're spending our lives on more than learning how to cope. Come on, baby, won't you take my hand? It's gonna be a rough road, but we gotta take this chance. Sometimes we're gonna fall, we'll get right back up again. Because this song is gonna last a lifetime. This song is gonna last forever. So may I have this dance. Oh, this song is gonna last forever.
Now playing Night of Fire, Peace in Sunlight.
You're listening to Independent TV and Radio Scotland. Channel Radio ICE.
Playing now. Fresh Body Shop, Outsider.
Do you really want to be responsible for this?
Playing now. Steve Blakely, The Terror of Highway 101.
He wore black denim trousers and motorcycle boots, a black leather jacket with an eagle on the back. He had a hopped-up Harley that took off like a gun, and he was called the Terror of Highway 101. When I was just a young boy, I heard a story told about an outlaw biker who was always on the road. They called him wild as fire and free as raging wind, and meaner than a werewolf when he's on a drunken binge. His engine roared like thunder